morning. Today we are back with the grammar, and in our last class what we did was we talked about the past tense, and today we are going to discuss about the relative clause. But before getting into the relative clause, let's understand what is clause. Clause is a combination of either a subject or verb and the object, where you have the verb and its object, or you have the subject and the verb, that we call it the clause. And now this clause, for example, let's take it. If I have this sentence with me, I am a teacher who teaches English. Now, if we check here, this part of the sentence does not need to rely upon any other part of the sentence for its meaning. This part can stand in isolation without this part. If we erase this part, still this part of sentence is able to function in its own. So this type of part, which is itself a complete sentence, this is a complete Now you see, who teaches English? This is not the complete sentence. So the part of a sentence where you get the complete sense and see the complete sentence, that type of part is called the independent or the main clause. That is called the independent or the main clause. Here in this sentence, what we see is this sentence can be divided into two different parts. And the first part of the sentence is a complete sentence in itself. Without this part can function as a complete sentence. This gives us the complete sense. But here the second case, who teaches English, cannot stand alone in isolation. This depends upon this part for its meaning, for its completeness, for its complete sense. This part of the sentence depends upon this part. So the part which one is independent, this part does not depend upon this part for the meaning. This part can stand alone without this part as a complete sentence. This type of part which does not depend upon the other part and is complete in itself, we call that part the independent. Because this is not dependent on any other part for its fullness, for its completeness. So this we call the independent clause or the main clause. And now this part, if we look at this part only cannot stand alone in isolation without this part. This part depends upon this part for the meaning. This part cannot be complete without this part. So this type of part of a sentence which cannot stand alone in isolation, which is not complete in itself and depends upon some other part for its complete meaning, for its completion. This type of part is called the dependent clause. This is called the dependent clause. Now, dependent clause have various different types. Now, that's active adverbial. Let's not get into that. What we are concerned about the dependent clause is, we are concerned about the relative clause. We are concerned about relative clause. Today our class concerns about this topic, which is the part of dependent clause, not the independent clause. Now, let's understand what is a relative clause. Now, Now here, what we see is, we again have the two parts. This part can function in its own. This part is a complete sentence. This part does not need any other part for its completion. This is the independent clause. Now, the second part, this dependent clause. This dependent clause is actually functioning as adjective. This is functioning as adjective. This is functioning as a quality indicating part of the sentence. Here what we see is, the quality of bike is being elaborated with the help of this sentence. This part of the sentence, this clause, sorry, that's the clause. That clause is actually explaining, adding, telling us, elaborating the quality of this bike. So relative clauses are those clauses which is used to describe the noun, right? For example, now here too, what I have done is, this is a building which is the smallest. Now this building's quality is being explained by this part of the sentence. This part of the sentence, this class is used to describe the noun, any noun. This is the man. This is the man who is the strongest, right? Here too what we are doing, we are explaining the quality of man with this clause. So relative clauses is a clause that is used to describe the noun. And this relative clause functions, it basically has a function as that of adjective. This is used to describe the noun, and this have the function basically of the adjective. Now, this relative clause always starts with the relative pronouns like who, which, that. So, dependent clause that starts with these relative pronouns and are explaining, telling the quality or adding something to the noun. This basically functions as the adjective. We call it the relative clause. And this relative clause have two types: defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. Now, what is defining relative clause and what is non-defining relative clause? We are supposed to study the non-defining relative clause. Now, let's get in this way. So we come to know these three things about the relative clause. This is a clause used to describe the noun. This basically functions as an adjective and begins with the relative pronoun like who, which, that, and etc. Now let's come to a sentence, and now this relative clause is of two types: defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. Now first let's understand what is defining relative clause. Defining relative clause provides us the important information, as a relative clause is always there to describe the noun. Now the relative clause that provides us the important information about the identification of that noun, we call it the defining relative clause. But if it does not provide the information that helps us to identify the object, rather is providing just the information about the noun, we call it non-defining relative clause. For example, let's take it this way. From the defining relative clause, we know the, okay, let me write this. here what I am doing is I am saying the museum which we visited on our tour to Kathmandu was the biggest in the country. Here I am identifying, I am actually defining this museum here. Here the essential information about the museum, the very essential information that is needed to know what someone is describing. Someone is describing the museum, that is the biggest one. So we are coming with the essential information. This information is actually defining the museum. So this type of relative clause which provides the essential information for the recognition of the subject matter of or the noun that we are talking about is called the defining relative clause. And non-defining relative clause is not essential for the recognition of the noun that we are describing. Rather, this is just to provide the supplementary information. Non-defining relative clause is just to provide the additional information. Now here in the first sentence, if we say visited the biggest museum, definitely this is indicating to which, that is this museum. It means here the part of this clause is directly in relation to museum and directly talking about the museum, defining it, providing the essential information. That is, this museum is the biggest. Here, though the information is provided, which we visited on the tour to Kathmandu, you are not directly defining the museum here. This part of sentence can have, okay, which was the biggest museum? That we visited in Kathmandu. Okay, so here you don't get the definition of the museum directly. But here the museum which we visited, oh, okay, sorry, I just made the mistake. The museum which we visited in Kathmandu is the biggest in the country. Here what we are doing is we are getting the direct definition of the museum. But here we are just supplied with the essential information. This part is not strictly defining the museum. So this type of case where the essential information about the noun is provided, but it is not defining it, it is not actually directly in connection to that noun, we call it the non-defining relative clause. But if that clause, that relative clause provides the very essential information, provides the information that is used to define the noun, then we call it the defining relative clause. So this is how we discriminate. Whenever we go via somewhere to talk about the information of this, that is the non-defining relative clause. When you have the straightforward information that provides the essential information about the noun, we call it the defining relative clause. So now our concern does not remain the defining relative clause. Our concern remains the non-defining relative clause. This non-defining relative clause is supposed to be mastered by us. And now, what are the examples given in your book? Let's check out. So non-defining relative clauses also uses who, which, that, whom. These are the things, relative pronouns. But these relative pronouns, the part of the sentence that is followed after this relative pronoun does not provide us the essential information that is supposed to be described. That is supposed to describe the noun, that is supposed to give us the definition of the noun, that is supposed to let us identify the quality of the noun. So those type of relative clause which are not doing these things, rather those type of clauses, relative clauses which are only providing us the additional information, we call it non-defining. So now how to provide the additional information about the noun we are talking? In your book, page number 28, it's given in 3, non-defining relative clause. Anna, who had just woken up. Okay, we are being provided the information about Anna, but we are not being provided the defining facts about Anna. Anna, who is fat. This is the defining relative clause, because this is providing the traits of identification. Anna, who had just woken up, was sitting in the bed yawning, who was just woken up. This is only providing us the additional information about Anna. It is not providing us the defining fact about Anna. So this type of clause is called the non-defining relative clause. And these non-defining relative clauses are used to talk about something, explain about something. For example, her car, which was 10 years old, gave a lot of trouble. Her car, which was 10 years old. We are being provided with the information of the car, but here we are not being provided with the defining information of the car. If I say the car which is blue, now see, you are getting the defining information, not just the essential. The car which is 10 years old, come on, you are not getting the defining one, you are getting the essential information here. The best idea to know which one is either the non-defining relative clause and which is the defining relative clause, there is a very tricky idea in grammatical punctuation. If you have the comma before the relative pronoun, that is the non-defining relative clause. If you don't have the comma, that is the defining relative clause. So mark this. While you are writing something, if you are providing the essential information to your readers, then you use the comma before your clause, because that is the non-defining relative clause. But if you are providing the thing that is defining the object or the subject or defining the noun, then you do not use the comma. So this is how we come to discriminate between defining and non-defining relative clause. I caught a sight of Alan, whom I hadn't seen for years. I caught a sight of Alan, who is a tall boy. Now I am giving the defining. Whose? What he is saying is, I caught the sight of Alan, whom I hadn't seen for years. Whom I hadn't seen for years. See, whom is talking to Alan. But this whom I hadn't seen for years is not providing the essential information that can be used to define Alan. But it is providing the additional information, merely some facts about the noun we are talking about. We are talking about Alan, but Alan's property is not being explained by this relative clause. Rather, this relative, whom I haven't seen for years, whom I haven't. See, the association of the description, as I told you earlier, is indirectly. Via something you went to the description. But in defining relative clause, we don't move via something. There is no transition in between. Rather, it's the direct association. Now, with the direct association, we don't use the comma, and with this indirect association where we have the supplementary additional information, we use the comma. Look at in your book too, the comma has been used there. Why? With the non-defining relative clause, we always use the comma. This is all that we need to know today, and tomorrow onwards we are again getting back to the literature. After the literature, we will be again with the grammar. Thank you, class.